Okay, so at this point, we've spent a lot of time discussing the structure or the anatomy of the integument. In this lecture video, we're going to spend time talking about the physiology or the function of the integument. So we've touched a little bit that we know that the integument or the skin is a barrier. Okay, so it's a barrier that it only allows certain things to enter, right, from the external environment. It keeps most things out. So some things that it keeps out that we've talked about are chemicals, microbes, excessive cold or heat, and UV light. Now, we also know that in the keratinization process, it performs sort of a watertight barrier that prevents us from losing too much water. Now, we know from some of our accessory structures, the exocrine glands, that we produce sweat, right, that we release, but we also lose water by a process that's just called transpiration. So just over time, right, small amounts of water leave our skin, but our skin does a great job of preventing us from losing too much water. And the reason we know that is because if we have someone who is a burn victim and their skin is not functioning properly because of the burns, there is a real concern with dehydration because of the accelerated loss of water. So we know our skin does a great job at preventing us from losing too much water from transpiration. Now, immune function. We also know that some of the secretions we talked about help prevent microbial growth on the surface of our skin. And we talked about in both the epidermal layer and in the dermal layer, there are some immune cells called dendritic cells that help engulf or phagocytize microbes or old, dying, dead cells. One thing we haven't touched on yet is vitamin D production. So our skin, specifically those keratinocyte cells that are in our skin, in the presence of UV light, they will convert a steroid molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol to vitamin D3. Now, sometimes you'll see the word cholecalciferol written there. That's just the fancy word for vitamin D3. Okay, so it converts the 7-dehydrocholesterol to vitamin D3 in the presence of UV light. Then in our body, that vitamin D3 gets transported to the liver and it goes through another couple chemical reactions. And then in the kidney, it's converted again. And ultimately, the product of those conversions is something called calcitriol. And this is essentially like the active form of vitamin D3. This is what's going to carry out the important function. Now, what is the important function? Well, probably you know that vitamin D has something to do with your bones, right? We know that some of our foods are fortified with vitamin D. Well, what this calcitriol, this active form of vitamin D3 does is it helps us absorb calcium and phosphate from our small intestine. So we eat, we digest our food. It helps to absorb those things into our bloodstream. So it plays a big role in balancing out how much calcium we have in our blood. Now, another function of the integument is secretion. So we talked about this we said that there are exocrine glands like the eccrine glands, the apocrine glands that release different types of sweat. We also know that there are sebaceous glands. And do you remember the substance that sebaceous glands release? It's that oily, waxy sebum, right? That's important for lubrication. All right. Now, I want to go back up for just a second, or actually let's talk about absorption a little bit. So when we said it serves as a barrier, right, that prevents some things from entering. However, our skin is selectively permeable in that it allows us to absorb some things. So we talked about through the keratinization process that those plasma membranes, as the cells die, become thicker and they become sort of impermeable to certain molecules. So what happens is it's nonpolar substances or more hydrophobic substances that are able to pass through our skin. So if you think about it, there are some drugs or pharmaceuticals that actually enter through the skin. So there are estrogen patches that people wear and they are absorbed through their skin. Then sometimes when people want to quit smoking, right, there might be a nicotine patch which releases nicotine to try to wean people off of smoking. All right, what's next? So let's talk about temperature regulation. We know from homeostasis, right, that our body needs to keep many things within certain narrow ranges, and the skin or the integument plays a role in our temperature regulation. So one way this happens is based on the blood vessels in our integument. So remember, the epidermis doesn't have vascular tissue, right? So it would be deeper than that. If we get too hot, okay, then we're going to have a sensor, right, that recognizes, oh, we're too hot. And so our control center in the brain is going to send a signal to the effectors, right, to do something about it. So one of those effectors would be our blood vessels. And if we're too hot, it would cause those to what we call vasodilate. And what that means is the diameter or the size of those blood vessels get larger. And what that does, it allows us to lose more heat. More blood goes to those. We can lose more heat through our skin. Now, the opposite, if we're too cold, right, then the signal that's going to be sent to those effectors is to vasoconstrict, which means it decreases the size of those blood vessels. So not as much blood travels through them, so we don't lose as much heat. In other words, more of the blood is kept toward the trunk of the body. Now, the other piece of our thermoregulation has to do with our sweat glands. So when we're too warm, they serve as an effector also, right? We release sweat so that it releases that liquid onto our skin so that we can cool off, right, as air blows over that moist skin. All right, lastly, sensory reception. We talked about this. We talked about that there are light touch receptors in the skin, and we have the deeper, more coarse touch receptors in the dermis. And we'll talk about details of how all those work when we get to the nervous system. But for now, we do know that in our integument, we can both have the fine touch, right, and the coarse touch receptors.